There is a great tendency to view welfare as financial or other assistance to an individual or family from a city, state, or national government. That is one context of the word. But welfare is more commonly the good fortune, health, happiness, prosperity, etc. of the people who live in our townships and cities, our state and our nation. Welfare in this context is a measure of both our individual and our collective well-being. While I understand very well that there is a role for government that involves direct financial or other assistance to an individual or family, the high demand of that direct financial or other assistance is often a measure of government's failure to invest in our mutual or collective well-being. Maybe an example would help clarify what I mean. The public infrastructure that brings clean water to each home and business or takes away waste is essential to a modern people whose population once drew water from a stream, where each home once had an outhouse and a burn barrel in its backyard. Our collective investment in public water and waste removal systems improves well-being for all of us. As our population has grown, policies that prohibit individual acquisition of water from lakes, streams, and private wells, and prohibits the private disposal of human waste in something like an outhouse or a burn barrel, have been made necessary to avoid trespass on neighbors' property, public health consequences associated with drinking unclean water, contagion from human waste in water, soil and air pollution. If you prohibit private acquisition and waste disposal, you must then make water acquisition and waste disposal available as public services. In my perfect world, a certain amount of water would be freely available to each resident at no charge for its use. A modest additional quantity would be available at a low price, and higher quantities would be available at the highest price. Commercial and industrial water use would be publicly available at the highest price, keeping in mind that the cost of water being used by a for-profit business enterprise should be wrapped into the cost of the goods and services that the business produces and would ultimately be paid by the consumers. Agricultural water use policy deserves special consideration and should be given the highest priority, along with incentives to reduce use through environmentally responsible farm practices, something I think our farm community is already on board with. So why not just make price concessions for low-income residential users? Well, because doing so would move this important public service out of the realm of mutual well-being and into the realm of charity. Water is a human need. Low-income residents should not be reduced to beggars, and residents with modest income should not be pressed into precarious circumstances to pay extra for water consumed by low-income residents. In my perfect world, socially necessary public services such as water distribution would never be privately owned or outsourced to private management. Once we agree to call water distribution a public service, if we agree to call it a public service, it should be publicly owned and publicly managed. Apparently, we have agreed to prohibit private waste disposal, but have not agreed to provide it as a public service. Instead, we mandate its purchase from privately owned waste disposal companies. I find this practice to be utterly reprehensible and classify it as crony capitalism. I have lived in places where waste disposal was publicly owned and publicly managed. Compostable waste was composted, recyclable waste was recycled. If I had surplus trash on a non-service day, I could take it myself to a disposal yard. The local yard accepted everything. Old bicycles and lawnmowers went in one place and toxic items went in another. But I could always dispose of waste at a convenient local yard that was open most hours. There was no charge for waste disposal. The cost of management was wrapped up in local taxes. There are so many problems with how we dispose of waste that I can only bring myself to address one. Recycling is a huge problem. We pay way too much to recycle too little. Public policy should support the local use of recycled materials to make finished goods. This is way too long, so I'll wrap things up with this. Ideally, the public sector would be reserved for a very limited set of goods and services, and all other production would be reserved to the private sector. The public sector would be publicly owned and publicly managed. The people who work there should be public employees. Privatizing and privately outsourcing public services is just crony capitalism. Public ownership of the public sector should not lead to socialism. Public services should not be made available as individual charity, but should instead be freely available for our mutual and collective well-being. I am Ernie Whiteside. I am asking you for your support to be the next state representative for Michigan House District 56.